Let us begin by defining the word existentialism. As you know, the term is bandied about to mean everything, from the posturing, defiant dilettantism of the beatniks on the left bank of the Seine in Paris, to a philosophy of despair advocating suicide, or to a system of anti-rationalist German thought written in a language so esoteric as to exasperate any reader. I want to point out, rather, that existentialism is an expression of profound dimensions of the modern emotional and spiritual temper and is shown in almost all aspects of our culture. It is found not only in psychology and philosophy, but it is prominent and even central in modern art, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Picasso, and it is central in the most powerful movements in modern literature, Dostoevsky, Baudelaire, Kafka, Rilke, and in modern dramatists such as Ionesco and Beckett. This cultural movement had its roots in the same historical situation, the same psychological crises and problems, which called forth the development of psychoanalysis and other forms of psychotherapy. It is true that existentialism had its birth in a time of crisis and therefore represents the revolutionary edge of modern art, modern literature, and modern thought. But I think this is in its favor and is why it is so important for psychotherapy, because the people that come for help to psychologists and psychiatrists are the people who also are caught in the psychological crises of the problems of our historical situation. The term existence comes from the root existere in Latin and means, literally, to stand out, emerge. This is what these artists and writers sought, whether they were painters or philosophers or involved in psychology or literature, namely, to portray the human being not as a collection of static substances or as a set of mechanisms or patterns, but rather as emerging, as becoming. That is to say, they wanted to picture the human being as existing, and this then is the basis of existential psychotherapy, the quest to see the patient as he really is, to find the patient as a human being rather than as merely a projection of our own theories about him. This is illustrated in the experience of every therapist, and the existentialists make a good deal of this, namely, that the encounter with another person brings that other person alive to us in a way that is very different from the external facts we know about him. When a patient comes to us, we may know a great deal about him from his case record, and we may have a fairly good idea of what the intake interviewers saw him as being. But when he himself steps in, we often have a sudden and sometimes powerful experience that here is a new person on a level quite different from our knowledge of specific things about him. Obviously, we need to know something about drives and mechanisms that are in operation in the other person's behavior. A familiarity with his patterns of interpersonal relationships is also highly relevant, as is information about his social conditioning, the meaning of his gestures, and so on. All these things are to the point, but when we confront this person, all our voluminous knowledge about him suddenly forms itself into a new pattern. It is not that our objective knowledge was wrong. It is, rather, that it takes its form and its meaning from the reality of the person of whom these specific things, habits, behavior, are expressions. Let me, in the hope of making this clear, present parts of a case history from one of my own patients. I want to show how this person experienced her own being. This patient was an intelligent woman of 28 who was obviously gifted in expressing what was going on within her. She had come for psychotherapy because of serious anxiety spells, severe self-doubts, and eruptions of rage which were sometimes uncontrollable. She had been born in Europe as an illegitimate child, and her mother in times of anger often reminded her of her origin and recounted how she had tried to abort her before she was born. In times of trouble, the mother had shouted at the little girl, "If you hadn't been born, we wouldn't have to go through all our present troubles." Now, in the 4th month of therapy, the patient had the following dream. I was in a crowd of people. They had no faces, they were like shadows. It seemed like a wilderness of people. Then I saw there was someone in the crowd who had compassion for me. This dream was, of course, a dream of her trust in the relationship with the therapist in an Anani Mao's world where she had felt she could find nobody as a person. At the next session, she reported that she had had an exceedingly important experience. This is her account of it. T. Remember that day? This was the day after the dream, walking under the elevated tracks in a slum area in New York, feeling the thought, I am an illegitimate child. I recall the sweat pouring forth in my anguish in trying to accept that fact. Then I understood what it must feel like to accept. I am a Negro in the midst of privileged whites. I am blind in the midst of people who see. Later on that night, I woke up, and it came to me this way. I accept the fact that I am an illegitimate child, but I'm not a child anymore. So it is, I am illegitimate. But that cannot be so either. I was born illegitimate. So then what is left? What is left is simply, I am. This act of contact and acceptance with I am, once gotten hold of, gave me for the first time in my life the experience. Since I am, I have the right to be. The woman then went on to describe what this experience was like. She wrote these words, "It is a primary feeling. It feels like receiving the deed to my own house. It is the experience of my own aliveness, not caring whether it turns out to be an ion or just a wave. It is like when I was a very young child. I once reached the core of a peach and cracked the pit not knowing what I would find, and then feeling the wonder of finding the inner seed. Good to eat in its bittersweetness. It is like a sailboat in the harbor being given an anchor so that, being made out of earthly things, it can by means of its anchor get in touch again with the earth, the ground from which its wood grew. It can lift its anchor to weather the storm or rest a little. It is like my saying to Descartes, not I think, therefore I am, but rather I am, therefore I think, I feel, I do. Now this woman's discovery of her own being occurs on a more fundamental level than what is generally called ego development. The ego is a part of the personality and traditionally a weak part, whereas the sense of being that I want to emphasize refers to your whole existence. It refers to unconscious levels as well as conscious. The ego is a reflection of the outside world. As Freud put it, a swivel between the ID and the reality outside. A sense of being, in contrast, is rooted in your own experience of existence. If it is only a mirroring reflection of the outside world, it is then, precisely, not your own sense of existence. Your being is not your capacity to see the outside world. It is, rather, the capacity to know yourself as the one who can see the world. In this sense, it is a precondition to what is called your ego development. Let us see what existential psychologists and psychiatrists mean in the discovery of the being of the patient. It is the being of the patient that has gotten into the complications and the blockages which result in the symptoms of problems. One of the important points along this line that the existential therapists make is that this being is always, like my woman patient, described earlier, a being in the world. This young lady could find her own being in relation to me, in relation to the tragedies in the world in which she lived. Being together means being together in the same world, and it means knowing each other in the context of this world. This is particularly important for patients in our day because they have generally lost their world. This is, of course, so with all of us, as was said in the book The Lonely Crowd. We have lost the world in which we feel at home. The writings of Frieda from Reichmann and Harry Stack Sullivan describe the state of this patient who has lost his world. They point out how the problems of loneliness, isolation, and alienation are not only the characteristics of our psychotherapeutic patients, and are not only dealt with in our psychiatric and psychological journals more and more, but they are reflections of the problems of our whole society, a society in which people of all sorts have the anxiety of isolation and alienation. Indeed, I believe, and there is much evidence for this, that we have much more of the kind of patient these days who is called schizoid, that is, the detached person, the unrelated person, the person who has no feeling and who tends towards depersonalization. We rarely have any more the hysterical patients that Freud dealt with, but we have the patients who have, by intellectualization, by technical formulations, become non-feeling, isolated persons who are trying to live despite their loss of a world. And so our problem in psychotherapy, and this the existential therapists put a great deal of emphasis upon, is how we can know and participate in the other person's world. We cannot know his world simply as a collection of objects which we view from the outside. In that case, we never would understand it at all. We cannot know it by sentimental identification, for in that case our understanding would not do any good. We have failed to preserve the reality of our own existence. This is indeed a difficult dilemma. I think we can get some light on it if we ask, what is the world in which you are and I am, the world in which we find our being? I define it as the structure of meaningful relationships, in which a person exists and in the design of which he also participates. In this sense, the world includes the past conditions of the patient, of you, and of me. But it is not simply those conditions, for we always are in the process of molding them. The existentialists distinguish three simultaneous aspects in which each of us finds his being in the world. The first is, of course, the environment, what they call in German the Umwelt, the world around, the biological world. The second is the world of our fellow man, the world called in existential thought Mitwelt, the with world. And thirdly, there is the world of our relation to ourselves, the Eigenwelt, the own world. Now the first, the environment, is something that all organisms have, animals as well as human beings. The existentialists do not at all neglect the reality of the natural world. As Kierkegaard put it, natural law is as valid as ever. The problems human beings confront are less and less in the biological world as such in our civilization, but rather in the Mitwelt, that is, the world of interrelationships with human beings. Here our world is very different from the world of animals. For sheep, the herd instinct consists of keeping the environment constant. Get a herd of sheep together, and you will find that with the exception of the time of mating and suckling, a group of collie dogs around them, or a group of children, would do as well for the sheep, providing that the environment is kept constant. With human beings, however, something very different happens. The meaning of the others in the group is determined by our relationship with them. We cannot accept any human group around us. Animals have an environment. We have a world, and this world includes the meaning of these other people to us, whether they are members of our family or friends, loved ones, people we can trust, whether they are hostile or are our enemies. The meaning of the group depends also on how I put myself into it. I never can experience its members as friends except as I commit myself to friendship. And thus human love can never be understood on a purely biological level, but always depends upon such factors as personal decision and commitment to the other person. In the environment, it is right to speak of adjustment and adaptation. I adapt to the cold weather. I adjust myself to the periodic needs of my body for sleep. The critical point is that the weather is not changed at all by my adjusting to it. But in the world of human beings, the interpersonal world, the categories of adjustment and adaptation are not accurate or even helpful. The term relationship is the right category. One can never speak of sexual adjustment as such. I think if one sets out to find sexual adjustment in love, what one develops are only the techniques that could block the relationship between oneself and the other human beings. One cannot speak of human beings as sexual objects, as Kinsey does. Once a person is a sexual object, you are not talking about a person anymore. The essence of the relationship is that in the encounter both persons are changed. Relationship always involves a mutual awareness, and this already is the process of being mutually affected by the encounter. But as I have said, the existentialists and the existential therapists also put emphasis upon the own world, the world of my relationship with myself. Unfortunately, this is what is dealt with in modern psychology most inadequately of all. It is fair to say that until the existential movement, there was very little awareness of the problems that arise in the relationship to oneself, one's own world. C.G. Jung had some awareness of that, as did Otto Rank. But by and large, we saw human problems as adaptations to the outside world or the techniques of interpersonal relationships. Now, however, we are discovering that the awareness of oneself, the capacity to relate to oneself, is of tremendous and basic importance. It is not merely a subjective inner experience, but rather it is the basis on which we see the real world around us. It is a grasping of what something in the world means to me, E.g., this bouquet of flowers on my desk is a reality and has a special meaning to me. The Japanese D.T. Suzuki, a leading interpreter of Zen Buddhism to the West, has remarked that in Eastern languages, adjectives always include the implication of firmness. That is to say, the flower is beautiful, means for me the flower is beautiful. Unfortunately, in our Western dichotomy between subject and object, we have developed the habit of thinking that we have said what is most true of the flower if we can say it is beautiful entirely divorced from ourselves, as though a statement is most true in proportion to how little we ourselves have to do with it. I think this is part of the reason that the people in the modern West have such a sense of alienation, loneliness, and separation from their world. The leaving of the Eigenwelt, the own world, out of the picture not only contributes to arid intellectualism, but also to the loss of vitality, and has much to do with the loss of the sense of reality of people's experiences. Another contribution of the existential therapists is their distinctive approach to the problem of time. They are struck by the fact that the most profound human experiences, such as joy, depression, and anxiety, occur in the dimension of time more than in space. That is, they affect radically the person's experience of time. In joy, it seems as though a moment may last for hours. In anxiety and depression, the person feels so bad because all sense of time has been blotted out. And so, the existentialist therapists boldly place time in the center of the psychological picture, and they then propose that it is not the past or the present that is the dominant mode of time for human beings, but rather the future. We can understand a person only as a trajectory moving toward a future. As Kierkegaard put it, the self is only that which it is in the process of becoming. Man understands himself as he is projected towards something. And this is a corollary of the fact that I implied in my definition at the beginning of this talk, namely, that the person is always existing, always emerging, and always is becoming something. The existentialists do not neglect the past, but they hold that these deterministic events of the past take their significance from how we use them in the present and the future. Now, it is a very curious fact in psychotherapy that whether or not a patient can even recall significant events of the past depends upon his decision with regard to the future. Every therapist has had patients who bring up past memories ad infinitum. They talk at great length about what happened in the past, and it never moves them. The whole recital is flat, inconsequential, and tedious. From an existential point of view, I think we know what is wrong with this kind of therapeutic hour. It is not that these patients have an impoverished past in which nothing interesting happened. It is, rather, that they cannot or do not commit themselves to the present and the future. The reason the past does not become alive is because nothing matters enough to them in the future. Some hope of working toward changing something in the immediate future, even though it be only overcoming present anxiety or other painful symptoms, or integrating oneself for future creativity, which is a higher goal, is necessary before any uncovering of the past will have reality. Let me now give a couple of implications for therapeutic techniques that come from existential points of view. Our general tendency in the West has been to believe that understanding follows technique. This belief holds that if you get the right technique, then you can penetrate the riddle of the patient. The existentialists hold that just the opposite is what is true, namely, that technique follows understanding. Therefore, one implication for psychotherapy is that the technique should depend upon our understanding of the person and should have flexibility, varying from patient to patient and from one phase to another in the treatment of the same patient. The specific technique to be used at a given point should be decided on the basis of what will best reveal the existence of the particular patient not 6 months ago or a year from now, but at this moment in his history, and what will best illuminate his present being in the world, which is, of course, all the being in the world he has. The flexibility, however, is never merely eclectic but always involves a clear understanding of the underlying assumptions of any method. Another implication in existential psychotherapy is that psychological dynamisms always take their meaning from the existential situation of the patient's own immediate life. I will take, for example, resistance and repression. Freud saw repression as related to bourgeois morality. That is, as the patient's need to preserve an acceptable picture of himself and therefore to hold back the thoughts, the desires, and so forth, which are unacceptable to the bourgeois moral codes, particularly his family's. Now, the existentialists say that that is a symptom rather than a cause, and that we have to go back to something deeper, namely, to the question of why the patient accepts or rejects his own freedom to choose his moral codes. The problem is basically the problem of the acceptance or rejection of his own potentialities. Why do some people make themselves over as simply conformists to bourgeois morality? Why do others not? This is the critical question. A third implication in existential therapy is the emphasis on presence. By this, I mean that the relationship of therapist to patient is taken as a real one. As my patient so well said in the dream she had before her tremendous insight. The therapist is not a shadowy reflector, not a shadow like all the other people in the world, but an alive human being who at that hour happens to be concerned not with his own problems, but with understanding and experiencing so far as possible the being and the world of the patient. The therapist does not project himself, his own whims and mood, into the situation, but gives himself as a real human being whose function is to be a bridge between the isolated patient and the world. Presence is found in therapists of various schools and different beliefs, differing, that is, on anything except the one central issue, namely, the assumption that a human being is not an object ultimately to be analyzed. Rather, he is an existential expression of reality who, as a human being, is always in process of becoming. Any therapist is existential to the extent that with all his technical training and his knowledge of transfer and dynamism, he still is able to relate to the patient as one existence communicating with another. One of my own teachers, the late Dr. Frieda from Reichmann, used to have a tremendous ability for relating as one existence communicating to another. What she used to tell us analytical students was that the patient does not need an explanation, he needs an experience. Now, there are other aspects of existential therapy, such as the importance of commitment, the importance of dealing with decisions and dreams, the importance of symbols and myths, but I will deal with those later. The main point I want to establish here is that it is possible to study man without fragmentizing him, to help human beings without destroying their humanity. Oedipus and self-knowledge to Oedipus is the myth of identity, the myth which explores the vicissitudes of the questions, who am I? Where did I come from? It is the myth of self-knowledge. In the Victorian period, Freud interpreted this myth in terms of the sexual pattern of his famous Oedipus complex. Robert Graves, on the other hand, regrets that this banal interpretation has become the popular one and asserts that it is a misunderstanding. I shall show here that Oedipus concerns self-knowledge, identity rather than the specific problems of sex and aggression. Nevertheless, I can understand why Freud's interpretation did have meaning for the Victorian age, since at that time it was the repression of people's sexuality. In particular, that was the central roadblock on their journey towards self-knowledge. Freud took this Oedipus myth as the picture of the sexual attraction between the child and the parent of the opposite sex, which portrays the child as experiencing guilt and fear of the parent of whom he is a rival. This is illustrated most clearly in the situation of boys, with the boy then suffering castration anxiety. Other schools, like Alfred Adler's, deny the instinctual aspect of the Oedipal conflict and see it rather as a power struggle between child and parent. The neo-Freudian cultural schools likewise tend to view it, as Horney does, in terms of the conflict with authority vested in the parent. In general, however, it is accepted in American thought along the lines made popular by Freud, that the little boy wants to have sexual relations with his mother and to marry her. Concurrently, he has the desire to kill his father, thereby putting his rival out of the way, and thus experiences all the conflicts of repression, anxiety, and guilt inherent in such a situation. Now I believe that Freud's view was nearer the truth when he emphasized, as he always did, the tragic aspect of the story. But I believe he was in error in interpreting the myth literally in terms of the sexual content. I propose to demonstrate that Oedipus transcends the problems of sex and aggression. Its tragic focus, rather, lies in the individual's self-consciousness, his struggles with his fate in self-knowledge and self-consciousness. When you read the actual drama of Oedipus as it came to Freud and comes to us from the pen of Sophocles, you will be surprised to see that it has nothing whatever to do with conflicts about sexual desire or killing the father, as such. These are all done with long ago when the drama begins. Oedipus is a good king, the mightiest head among us all, he is called, who has reigned wisely and strongly in Thebes and has been for a number of years happily married to Queen Jocasta. The only issue in the drama is whether he will recognize what he has done. The tragic issue is that of seeing truth about oneself. Oedipus' tragic flaw is his wrath against his own reality. All through the drama, we hear the questions cried out by Oedipus and repeated with increasing anguish. Who am I? Where did I come from? As the curtain of the drama rises, Thebes is suffering under a plague. The city is literally sick. Oedipus says to the crowd gathered around Apollo's altar, I know you are sick, yet there is not one of you, sick though you are, that is as sick as I myself. Word has been brought from the oracle that the plague will be lifted only when the murderer of the old king, Laius, is discovered. Oedipus calls in the old blind seer, Tiresias, and thereupon there proceeds in the drama a gripping and powerful unfolding, step by step, of Oedipus' self. Knowledge. It is an unfolding that is replete with rage, anger at the truth and those who are its bearers, and all other aspects of man's most profound struggle in recognizing his own reality. Tiresias' blindness can be taken to symbolize the fact that a person can more deeply grasp inner reality about human beings, that is, gain insight, if he is not so distracted by the impingement of external details. Tiresias at first refuses to answer Oedipus' questioning as to who is the guilty one. Tiresias cries, how terrible it is to know, where no good comes from knowing. Of these matters I was full aware, but let them slip me. The drama then unfolds as the progressive revelation of Oedipus to himself, the source from which the truth proceeds being not Oedipus, but Tiresias. The whole gamut of psychotherapeutic reactions, like resistance and projection, are exhibited by Oedipus as he fights the more violently against the truth the closer he gets to it. He accuses Tiresias of planning to betray the city. Is this why the blind seer will not speak? Tiresias answers, I will not bring remorse upon myself and upon you. Why do you search these matters? Oedipus, always quick to anger, shouts, you would provoke a stone, tell us, you villain, tell us, and do not stand there quietly unmoved and balking at the issue. Tiresias answers, if I may say so, like a good therapist, you blame my temper, but you do not see your own that lives within you. Then in a burst of angry projection, Oedipus accuses Tiresias of having killed Laius himself. When Oedipus is finally told the truth by the goaded seer, that he himself is murderer of his father, Oedipus turns upon Tiresias and Creon with the charge that these words are inventions, that they are part of their strategy to take over the state. The emotional writhing of Oedipus might look dramatically contrived, did we not see it every day in the week in our patients. These forms of behavior, termed resistance and projection, are an understandable part of every man's bitter struggle over the impossibly heavy and painful burden of responsibility for knowing himself, enduring the revolutionary impact on his self-image and his identity. The former, resistance, is an acting out of the conviction, I cannot bear to admit it is I, so I will not see it. The latter, projection, is a way of crying out, if it is true, it is somebody else, not I, not I. Now the role of the woman, Jocasta, is very interesting here. First, she tries to persuade Oedipus to put no stock in the seer's accusations. Do not concern yourself about this matter, she says, listen to me, and learn that human beings have no part in the craft of prophecy. But then, as he begins to see that some portentous mystery surrounds his birth, she now herself senses some terrible knowledge that awaits him. She tries desperately to dissuade him. Why should man fear, she says, since chance is all in all for him, and he can clearly foreknow nothing? Best to live lightly, as one can, unthinkingly. As to your mother's marriage bed, don't fear it. Before this, in dreams too, as well as oracles, many a man has lain with his own mother. But he to whom such things are nothing, bears his life most easily. When Oedipus still proclaims his resolve to seek and face the truth, whatever it may be, she cries, I beg you, do not hunt this out. I beg you, if you have any care for your own life. What I am suffering is enough. And a few moments later, she begins to see the truth that this man is actually her son. She cries out, O Oedipus, God help you. God keep you from the knowledge of who you are. The blame, the onus for saying to Oedipus, do not seek self-knowledge, is here put on the feminine principle, Jocasta, the woman. I think the reason for that is that the original breaking out of the womb of every human being was from the actual womb of his mother, and every subsequent act is a reenactment both of the fight against the mother, who now represents the individual's fear of moving ahead, and an expression of anger and hostility for her having ejected him in the first place. But Oedipus will not hesitate, is not dissuaded. He insists that he must know what he is and where he is from. I will not hearken, he says, not to know the whole. Break out what will, I shall not hesitate. Finally, they summon the old shepherd who rescued the infant Oedipus from death on the mountainside, and who is the one man who can provide the final link in the fateful story. Oedipus literally has to twist his arm to make him talk. The shepherd cries, Oh, I am at the horror, now to speak. Oedipus answers, and I to hear. But I must hear, no less. When Oedipus does learn the final tragic truth, he cuts out his eyes. It is important that he is not castrated, nor does he castrate himself. He cuts out his eyes, the organ of seeing. The tendency to call this a symbolic castration would miss the whole point, and would be another example of using a theory, e.g., the primacy of sexual prototypes, as a Procrustean bed on which to force the data. Nobody is particularly troubled by sex in this drama. Sex and love and passion are accepted and affirmed, and the Greek chorus, made up of the so-called bourgeoisie, is only sympathetic with Oedipus. Jocasta gives the impression of being a desirable bed partner, and the implication is that she and Oedipus had had an eminently satisfactory sexual life. The issue is something quite different, namely, seeing that one is a sexual creature, acknowledging the implications thereof, and recognizing that Oedipus and you and I are creatures of passion. We are bearers of the demonic. The message is the bringing of sex and the demonic into consciousness, and the facing of this in our self-knowledge. In this sense, the drama is much more pertinent to contemporary psychotherapy, for the issue with our patients rarely is sexual repression or acceptance as such anymore, but, rather, taking responsibility for sexuality and passion. Oedipus' punishment is exile, first self-imposed but later, as it is in the drama we shall look at presently, imposed by Creon and the dictators who have taken over the city of Thebes. The tragedy now comes full circle. Oedipus was originally exiled when he was an infant a few days old, on his father's order, and his life ends again in exile. The exile is a fascinating symbolic act from our modern psychotherapeutic viewpoint. We have much data to indicate that the greatest threat and greatest cause of anxiety for contemporary Western man, in the middle of the 20th century, is not castration but ostracism, the terrible situation of being thrown out of the group. Many a contemporary man castrates himself or permits himself to be castrated, that is, gives up his power, originality, and independence because of fearing exile if he does not. He renounces his power and conforms under the greater threat and peril of ostracism. We now turn to the drama Oedipus at Colonus, in which Sophocles pictures how this old man, Oedipus, at the end of his life, looks back upon these tragic occurrences, and how he reconciles himself and his own self-knowledge with these terrible things. This is the drama of Oedipus' reconciliation, reunion, not only with himself, but with his fellow men in the persons of Theseus and the Athenians. And it is, finally, a reconciliation with the ultimate meaning in his life. As his daughter, Ismene, says, "For the gods who threw you down sustain you now." This drama was the last one Sophocles was to write. He wrote it when he was an old man of 89, and it may thus be taken as his valedictory, a distillation of the wisdom of a perceptive and profound man in his old age. The first and obvious theme in Oedipus' meditation at Colonus. Colonus is the woods behind Athens, where Oedipus and his daughter, Ismene, find themselves in this drama, is the difficult problem of ethical responsibility to self-consciousness. Is a man guilty if the act was unpremeditated, done unknowingly? In the course of his probing, old Oedipus comes to terms with his guilt. He defends himself indignantly against the brash accusations of Creon. "If then I came into the world, as I did come, in wretchedness, and met my father in fight, and knocked him down, not knowing that I killed him, nor whom I killed. Again, how could you find guilt in that meditated act? As for my mother, damn you, you have no shame, though you are her own brother. But neither of us knew the truth, and she bore my children also. While I would not have married her willingly, nor willingly would I ever speak of it." Again, about his father, he cries out, "I have a just extenuation. This, I did not know him, and he wished to murder me. Before the law, before God, I am innocent." It is clear here that Oedipus accepts and bears his responsibility. He does not say my unconscious did it, or my conditioning did it, or my emotional environment did it. He says, I did it, but he still insists that the delicate and subtle interplay of conscious and unconscious factors, as we would now call them, makes any legalistic or Pharisaic imputation of guilt inaccurate and wrong. The problem of guilt is as much within the heart as within the act, and he holds, as the whole drama of Sophocles holds, that the sins of meanness, avarice, and irreverence of Creon and Polonius are no less grave than the sins of passion for which Oedipus was punished. In condemning Creon and Polonius to a merciless justice, Oedipus is actually raising the ethical level of ancient Greece. The play points toward a conclusion that is emphasized by modern existential psychologists, namely, that because of the interplay of conscious and unconscious factors in guilt and the impossibility of legalistic blame, we are forced into an attitude of acceptance of the universal human situation. We are all in the same boat, and we must recognize the participation of every one of us in man's inhumanity to man. The plays of Genet and Sartre on guilt and responsibility are endeavors to present this truth in its modern form. Returning to the action of our play, we find that the hero, King Theseus, comes out to meet Oedipus in the grove at Colonus. Theseus is an unneurotic man with no inner conflict whatever. Nevertheless, his words are poignant. "For I too," he says, "was in exile. I know I am only a man. I have no more to hope for in the end than you have." The whole drama, we could understand from Theseus' words, has to do with the questions. What does it mean to be only a man? How can we come to the knowledge of ourselves as individual men? This leads to the second theme in this integrative drama, namely, the power of Oedipus, now that he has suffered through his terrible experience and come to terms with them, to impart grace. As he says to the natives who find him with his daughter in the grove at Colonus, "For I come here as one endowed with grace, by those who are over nature, and I bring advantage to this race." Theseus acknowledges this. Your presence, as you say, is a great blessing. This capacity to impart grace is connected with inner factors, the maturity and the other emotional and spiritual qualities which result from the courageous confronting of his shattering experiences. Says Oedipus, "One soul, I think, often can make atonement for many others if it be devoted. But there is also a clear symbolic element to make the point of his grace unmistakable. The oracle has revealed that his body after death will ensure victory to the land and the ruler which possess him. The mere presence of his body has this power." The final theme that Sophocles draws out of his two dramas is love, the messenger who came back to report to the people. In Colonists, the marvelous manner of old Oedipus' death tells the people that the old man's last words to his daughters were, "And yet one word frees us of all the weight and pain of life. That word is love." But Oedipus and Sophocles do not at all mean love as the absence of aggression or as the absence of the strong affects of anger. We see here a significant interrelationship between love and self-assertion, between love and will. Old Oedipus is a man of strong will at the beginning of the drama, and even stronger here at the end. His sharp and violent temper, present at the crossroads where he killed his father years before and exhibited in his sharp thrusts with Tiresias, is still in this last drama unsubdued by suffering or maturity. The fact that Sophocles does not see fit to remove or soften Oedipus' aggression and his anger, the fact, that is, that the aggression and the angry effects are not the flaws that he as old Oedipus get over. Nor does anybody apologize for the sexual passion of Oedipus, lend support to our thesis that the aggression and the sex are not the central issues of the drama. And finally, describing Oedipus' miraculous death and burial, the messenger says, "But some attendant from the train of heaven came for him, or else the underworld opened in love the unlit door of earth. For he was taken without lamentation, illness, or suffering. Indeed, his end was wonderful if mortals ever was." This touching and beautiful death of a great character is magnificent as Sophocles presents it dramatically. If the first play, Oedipus Tyrannus, is the drama of the unconscious, the struggle to confront the reality of the dark, demonic, destructive forces in man, so the second play, Oedipus at Colonus, is the drama of consciousness, the aspect of the myth which is concerned with the search for meaning and reconciliation. Both together comprise the myth of man confronting his own reality, the search for self-knowledge, a confronting that is made possible and inevitable by the unique structure of self-consciousness. We have seen how the myth of Oedipus in these two dramas leads to the self-knowledge not only of Oedipus but of ourselves as we let the myth affect us. The existential psychologists believe that myths of all kinds, to the extent that they are universal, have this power of revealing ourselves and also have a healing power which I will deal with in the next talk. This power resides on one hand in the fact that the myth, as we have seen in the case of Oedipus, elicits and brings forth into awareness the repressed, unconscious, archaic urges, longings, dreads, and other psychic content. This is the regressive function of the myths. But on the other hand, the existentialists hold, the myth reveals something positive. It reveals new goals, new ethical insights and possibilities. It is a breaking through of greater meaning which was not present before. Myths in this respect are ways of working out the problem on a higher level of integration. This is the progressive function of the myths. The tendency has been almost universal in classical psychoanalysis to reduce the latter to the former, to treat myths in terms of regressive phenomena which are then projected into ethical and other forms of meaning in the outside world. The upshot of this is that the integrative side of myths is lost. This is shown in the great, almost exclusive, emphasis upon the first drama, Oedipus Tyrannus, and the almost total neglect of the second drama, Oedipus at Colonus. Myths are means of discovery. They are a progressive revealing of structure in our relation to nature and to our own existence. They are also a revelation of new ethical forms. Myths are educative, in its original meaning educatio, in that they draw out some inner reality that enables the person to experience a greater reality in the outside world as well. The whole drama, the myth of Oedipus, hinges on the theme, what is a man, and who am I as a man? Theseus, the non-neurotic hero, as well as Oedipus in great conflict, echo the same theme of identity. I know I am only a man. Even the riddle of the Sphinx, which lies like a translucent symbol at the portal of the city and of the play, is again a form of this question. What is man? The whole problem of the Greeks, and our problem, and man's problem in whatever age he may live, is to find our place as human in the universe. For the Greeks, this meant the hanging in a precarious balance between nature and the gods, a partaking of both but not identifying oneself with either. If they identified themselves with the gods, the Greeks said, men were guilty of hubris, inordinate pride, and were destroyed. If they identified themselves with nature, they lost the rational function, the soul, the consciousness that distinguished them from animals. Man is the creature who partakes in nature, who has passions and unfortunately does, kill those he is closest to. But he is also the creature who is conscious, and we therefore can and must confront and come to terms with these passions and the guilt they bring upon him. For those who have the courage, like old Oedipus, this can be done through a progressive self-knowledge, a method that brings a new integration into possibility. And this new integration, the dramas tell us, can be characterized by the acceptance of responsibility, by grace, and by love. The healing power of symbols and myths_. Most people in our day think of symbols and myths as the dead hangovers from a useless past. I want to show something very different. I want to show that symbols and myths are the most vital parts of our experience and that they have a healing power. Let me illustrate what I mean by symbols and myths. When I was on a ship coming into the harbor of Istanbul, I saw the flags of different nations on the other ships in the harbor. I noticed the red and white of the Turkish flag, the blue, yellow, and red of the Romanian, and the French tricolor of the ship on which I was a passenger. I observed with interest these colored cloths waving in the breeze. I registered in my mind the various nations to which they belonged, and I mused on how many countries it took to make up Europe. Then as my ship went round the turn of the harbor, I saw suddenly the American flag. My reactions were entirely different. I had an experience which grasped my total self, a surging moment of joy, then a longing for my country which I had not seen in several years. My mind was flooded with all the rich and potent connotations of homeland. Now the other flags of the other nations are signs. They stand for something, which I decode and make a note to remember as fact. But my own flag is a symbol to which I respond with my total being. It sounds banal to me now, as I suppose always one's own myths do. But those broad stripes and bright stars are the 13 original states from which my great-grandfather migrated west. I am overcome, then, with the myths of my homeland. The flag is my childhood where I grew up in a little town in Michigan. The flag is my family who are still there, and my hopes for them. It is also my conflicts about my past and future. The symbol expresses certain values which I identify with my country: security, hope, temporary loneliness and sadness, and moral conflict, particularly these days associated with the demonic aspects of nationalistic power and atomic bombs in Vietnam. Now the myth is a story in which the symbols are brought together and are portrayed in the experiences of a living person. A myth embodies the symbol in historical experience and forms it into a drama which carries the values of our society. We find our myths all about us in the unconscious assumptions of our culture. We mold the myths and we use them as the images in which we can recognize ourselves, our friends, and our fellows. We use them as guides to our ways of life. Marshall McLuhan rightly says, "We actually live mythically and integrally, as it were, but we continue to think in the old, fragmented space and time patterns of the pre-electric age." Now, symbols and myths are reflections inside the person of experiences of a reality outside. They make the structure of life and the structure of man's universal experience alive on my own pulse and on your own pulse as you experience symbols and myths. By these symbols and myths, we as individual men participate in the structure of the universe. Symbols and myths carry the values and the human meaning of this structure. When I was visiting the shrine at Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré in Quebec in Canada, I noticed that the theologians, in the writings that they had placed here and there, separate the spiritual act of faith from the actual water there that people drink. And they emphasize time and again that the water is a symbol and that the healing comes not from the water itself, but through the faith of the believer and the capacity of God to act through the water. The water is a genuine symbol in that it participates in the reality that is healing as a function. Water is health-giving. But the symbol transcends the reality of the water and becomes the vehicle by which the religious mind can experience the healing power of God. The myth in this sense represents not a particular truth but an eternal truth. The myth of Adam, for example, is the story of the birth of human consciousness. It represents this birth in the experience of every man, and hence it is more true than would have been the case if Adam had been an actual historical person who happened to live some thousands of years ago. Not only are symbols and myths vehicles of religious healing, they are also vehicles of psychological healing, and this is what I want to talk about now. I want to present the structure of life, of a particular way of life, namely, experiences that every young man goes through. For our purpose, we shall draw upon a particular myth that has been handed down from ancient Greece, the myth of Orestes. Orestes, like all human beings, was born of two parents and must face the vicissitudes of growing up. In the process of growing up, he must establish his independence from his mother, and he must identify, if he is to become a man, with his father. Now you may recall the myth that goes into the drama trilogy that Aeschylus presents to us, called Orestia. This story is of the returning king Agamemnon, who was filled with inordinate pride in his victory over the Trojans. He comes back to his kingdom of Mycenae, and there he is tangled in a fishnet in his bath by his wife, Clytemnestra, and murdered. Orestes then kills the mother who has assassinated his father, and is pursued to the ends of the earth by the Furies. These are symbols of avenging spirits of guilt, symbols of remorse that drive him into virtual madness. Our young man, Orestes, finally collapses with his arms around Apollo's altar at Delphi. Here, in the story, he is given blood cleansing and is sent to Athens under Apollo's protectorship. Now the conflicts that are being worked out in this myth presented in the drama was to the ancient Greeks and is to us the unfolding of man's destiny. The myths are the battles of the gods, now no longer fought far away on Mount Olympus, but the gods in each man's own unconsciousness, the battles of the gods in the structure of each man's deepest experience. Let me ask you now to imagine a young Greek citizen of the 5th century BC watching, as did the other 30,000 people of Athens, on the side of the Acropolis, this drama and myth of Orestes presented in the religious ceremonies. What would this young man be experiencing? He would be a young man who comes out of the structure of human existence that is common to all of us, i.e., he must overcome the ties of embeddedness, particularly if his mother is a power-driven, exploitative mother, as Clytemnestra was. The upheavals which are inescapably involved in such a struggle have their parallel in this young Greek man and in ourselves in the emergence of a new dimension of moral responsibility in the culture. Now the Greeks would be seeing the drama which presents an extreme form of this freedom from mother, namely, Orestes killing his mother. But the fact that this is extreme is an expression simply of the power of the archaic unconsciousness in each one of us. It should not dull the fact that all of us should grow through and go through this freedom from the biological ties to the mother, and if we are to grow into manhood, should identify and become psychologically related, not now in dependency, but in independence with the father. Now the myth would then, as this young Greek sees it, communicate to him that the experience which he is going through in his own family life is part of the universal human situation. Therefore, the guilt is like that of every young man growing up and growing away from his family. Therefore, his guilt can be confronted, transcended, and ultimately forgiven. As Aristotle put it, the drama heals the fractious spirit. As our young Greek would observe, as we observe, the outworkings of Orestes' career in this drama, he would see that something more than Orestes' personal life is at stake. On the vaster stage of history, the myth and the drama mark the beginning of civilization. They mean that human beings are now taking, and will henceforth take, responsibility for their own lives. That is shown in the dramatic myth when Orestes is brought to Athens before Athena, and she proclaims that the case is too important and too crucial for the future of mankind for one person to be the judge. Even a god like herself cannot decide such an important case, and so the court is called a court with a jury. And the jury is not made up of gods from Mount Olympus. The jury that Athena calls is made up of 12 citizens of Athens, namely, men not gods, even before the vote of the jury as to whether Orestes is guilty or to be forgiven. Athena announces that in the case of a tie, she will cast her vote to forgive the young man. This is the author's way of getting Athena's vote out on the table to start with, and thus requiring that the citizens in their deliberations assume the responsibility of the last word. The court finally votes to forgive Orestes, saying that in the vicissitudes of the structure of human existence, every young person must go through the struggle of becoming free from the parents and must assert his own biological independence, and psychological and spiritual freedom. But the problem, then, is how can Orestes take responsibility for his life if at the same time he was required by the gods to kill his mother? Fate required it, and he had to go through the subsequent suffering and turmoil which almost drove him to madness. Apollo states directly at the trial, "I commanded him to do it." Now, if the act is under the command of a god, if it is fate, what the Greeks called moira, and could not be refused, how then can we say that Orestes is guilty? But Orestes leaves us with no doubt at all. At every point in the play, he affirms his responsibility. He does not say, "My fate did it," as many a present-day patient in psychotherapy says by implication, or "my unconscious did it," or "my past conditioning did it." Orestes boldly states, "Jade did it." Now what we see coming out of this myth is a healing of the conflicts within the soul of the young man by virtue of raising his consciousness to a higher level. It is not simply a wiping out of experience. Rather, it makes human experience something more complex, a higher moral and spiritual plane of consciousness in which there is a resounding affirmation of both fate and moral responsibility. The new dimension of consciousness now embraces fate and freedom, determinism and choice, the requirements of social morality, and the responsibility of the individual person. And all of these have their locus within the individual psyche in its relation to the world. You cannot do this by logic. It is, strictly speaking, illogical. But through its presentation of the feeling, the thinking, and the philosophical, the religious, the artistic totality of human experience, the myth can bring these opposites together. The healing that Orestes goes through, and that our young Greek man watching the play would experience by identifying with Orestes, also encompasses something else, the union of, the bringing together of, reason and irrationality. This is revealed in the myth and the drama by the way Athena deals with the two chief adversaries, one Apollo and the other the Furies. Athena knows very well that justice and the future health of the city will not come by the simple triumph of one of these over the other. She is also well aware that Apollo, the intellectual, can be as cruel in his calm, implacable, rational detachment as the Furies in their primitive anger and vengeance. When Apollo arrogantly appeals for power to force the barbaric past in the form of the Furies out of existence, Athena answers, no. She knows that her own nature is that which reconciles the female and male, and she has a deeper intelligence than the rationality of Apollo. Referring to the Furies, she says to Orestes, "Yet these, too, have their work. We cannot brush them aside, and if this action so runs that they fail to win, the venom of their resolution will return to infect the soil and sicken all my land to death. Here is dilemma. Whether I let them stay or drive them off, it is a hard course and will hurt." Now this is a beautiful statement, 24 centuries ago, of what we have learned again from the scientific vantage point of modern psychotherapy, namely, that anger, rage, resentment, and similar emotions, if driven out or repressed, will return to infect the person, to sicken the individual and the group. If that repression takes place at the demand of rationality, that is, the higher intellectual functions which are symbolized by our highly respected Apollo, this does not make the repression the slightest less morbid. After the vote goes against the Furies, they, true to their threat, vow to lay waste to the city of Athens. At this point, a fascinating thing happens which must indeed have been gripping to the Greek audience watching these dramas. Athena persuades the Furies to accept something that they did not know they wanted, a role in the city in which they can keep their power and divinity, but use them in the service of constructive aims. The Furies now will receive the affection of the citizens, and even the name of Furies is changed. They are now called Eumenides, or workers of grace. At the end of the great trilogy of dramas, they offer a prayer that the citizens will render, grace for grace. Let love be their common will. Let them hate with a single heart. Much wrong in the world is thereby healed. Now this phrase, hate with a single heart, is a stumbling block for many modern people. But the myth and the drama are trying to show us that the demonic powers can be taken into consciousness in such a way that they become workers. of grace. The Furies do not lose their demonic character, for if they did, they would become vapid, listless, banal, unable to contribute power for anything. This is what we saw in the last talk in connection with Oedipus. If Oedipus had lost his anger, if he had become vapid and listless, then the real meaning of his love and of his moral working through would be lost. Man cannot obliterate the demonic aspects of his emotions, and he should not repress them. But he can take them into consciousness, as Athena says, and he can make the demonic, as he can make the demonic urges within himself, and as the Furies are made to in Athenian civilization, contribute to the positive functions of himself and his city. Thus our young Athenian, sitting on the slopes of the Acropolis as a participant observer in the ceremony of the Orestia, would not receive simple answers to life's problems. He would see rather that there are no simple answers. He would learn that the issue to be decided is not right against wrong, but right against right. And this is what makes the dramatic myth a tragedy. Tragedy is the clash of two rights. Its outcome is not a simple solution of justice. Its impact and its outcome are, rather, a widening and a deepening of consciousness so that the participants can incorporate both the antinomies, that is, the opposites, into their psychological and spiritual experience and can live constructively with them. Here, of course, I use tragedy as a positive word, showing the constructive depth of human consciousness, just as I use myth as a positive word. The myth helps us to reconcile opposing feelings. The function of these dramatic myths is to bring the audience to a new level of consciousness which embraces both Apollo and the Furies, both freedom and responsibility, both love and hate, both demonic primitive drives and sophisticated rationality. The myth, by drawing out the various levels of unconscious experience, lifts the person out of his simple oppositions and makes of the hopeless antinomy a creative dialectic. This is the central aspect of the normal therapy of the myth, the healing function of the myth that was given to the Athenians and the Greek citizens by the presentation of this myth in which the Athenian people as a whole could participate, and 24 centuries later these myths still have the same healing power to speak to us. Now the Orestes myth is reinterpreted and remolded by modern writers to deal with our modern period. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a new form of the Orestes myth called The Flies. Robinson Jeffers wrote also a modern form called The Tower Beyond Tragedy. I want to conclude our discussion by pointing out the different kind of healing effect that we need in our day by contrasting the play of Jean-Paul Sartre, The Flies, with the drama as Aeschylus wrote it. Where Aeschylus is so magnificently objective, that is, regardless of what Orestes feels, the drama moves on anyway with the strength of the mountains that encircle Athens. Sartre is subjective, like modern man. Sartre's Orestes varies so much in his feelings in the drama that at times the tragedy bids fair to slide into a mere series of chance happenings which, indeed, is a reflection of modern man's confusion. Aeschylus' hero progresses towards his destiny with the steadiness of an inexorable but majestic fate, whereas Sartre's hero seems propelled by whim. Aeschylus' gods and demonic figures are cruel but great. Sartre's gods are tired, pathetic, and bad-smelling. Aeschylus believes in the divinity of the divine. Sartre believes in the divinity of man's will to stand against the gods. Now the Sartre play sounds negative, but in reality, in my judgment, it is not. Sartre is trying to say that modern man is caught in a strange situation of the disintegration of his values in this transitional age in which we live, and that for his human fulfillment and human dignity, he must develop the capacity to defy Zeus. This defiance should be assumed, however, in the name of something greater, namely, the purification of Argos from its morbid guilt and the dignity and integration of the human individual. Human integration, Sartre is telling us, is the capacity to face and endure despair. As Sartre puts it, freedom and human life begin on the far side of despair. This dignity is the capacity of man to know he is a man and to act on that knowledge. Aeschylus was writing in an age when the symbols and myths had unity, and his Greece thus has a structure of meaning within which to live. This is why he can be so clear and objective. But when the myths and symbols break down, as happened 3 centuries after Aeschylus, the Hellenistic period, and has happened in our own modern time, the individual is thrown on his own. Sartre's hero, therefore, experiences on the one hand the great impersonal flow of external events, and at the same time, he has no fixed inner pattern, no superego. He is always in danger of foundering in his own alienated subjectivity, but, says Sartre's Orestes, man must assert himself both against the confusion of external fate and despite the fact that he has no inherited morality which will give him a clear map for life. Now this contrast between Aeschylus and Sartre in their presentation of this eternal myth of Orestes leads us to the very heart of the existential problem. The modern dramas, which are exceedingly existential by and large, present the tragedy of modern man in his full self-consciousness. That is, they reveal modern man's self-consciousness as having no content. The mask is fully removed, and what we see on the stage in so many of the great modern dramas, there are not so many great ones, but those that are great show this, is modern man's struggle with emptiness. Take, for example, Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh, or take Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Here the actors wait forever, and the problem always is, was there a tree here yesterday? Is there a tree now? And will there be a tree tomorrow? The greatness of these tragedies is shown in our day by the negation of belief. It is shown in the reverse, like the negative of a film. This is felt on the stage as the tragic state in which greatness has fled from man. The vacuum, the emptiness, indeed the apathy, is the tragic fact. Now the art form of the drama itself transcends this emptiness, as all art does, and it makes this emptiness a new symbol, a pregnant symbol. It makes of this very emptiness a holy void in which being can speak anew to us. Does this sound pessimistic to you? I believe it is not pessimistic, but that these forms are the modern myth, vide Sartre, Robinson Jeffers, Eugene O'Neill, Beckett. These forms of the myth also have a healing power for us. They help us to face our fate. Of course, our fate is not determined by a particular god like Apollo. We do not believe, as the Greeks did, in fate as Moira. This is simply not part of our contemporary language. But though fate is not a specific god, it is the necessity no human being can escape. Fate is the limitation and the trauma of childhood experience, and the confining locale of our birth. Fate is the limitation of bodily strength and of intellectual capacity. Fate is my being an individual, and I, who can therefore never fully understand you as thou. There will always be some part of you that is a stranger to me, and some part of me that is a stranger to you. Fate is death, the eternal loneliness that none of us can escape, however much we may try to think so in our age of tremendous progress in the great society. The capacity to be aware of these fateful conditions in itself makes possible a freedom in the face of fate. Not that we become free from fate. On the contrary, we still must die, and we still are limited. The Greeks were very severe towards those who had the naive illusion that they could overcome human finitude. Neither is it that man becomes master of his fate, as the Victorians fondly believed. This, the Greeks would have said, and rightly so, is an arrogance that precedes the humbling fall. It is, rather, that man is free to choose how he is to encounter his fate. He chooses how he can relate to his destiny. The new level of consciousness lies in his experiencing himself as the man who can stand before fate, and who by consciousness can transcend his fate. I close now with a quotation from a great French existentialist of 4 centuries ago, the physicist and religious man, Blaise Pascal. Pascal says about man, "But were the universe to crush him, man would yet be more noble than that which slays him, because he knows that he dies, and the advantage the universe has over him. Of this the universe knows nothing." Will and decision in existential force psychotherapy. Practically everyone has heard that the existentialists are very much concerned with human will and decision. They seek to rediscover human will, and this is particularly important because in our day human will has become destroyed, especially in the field of psychology. One of the contributions of Sigmund Freud, the most influential of modern psychologists, lay in his cutting through the futility and self-deceit of Victorian willpower. This willpower was conceived by our 19th century forefathers as the faculty by which they made resolutions and then purportedly directed their lives down the moral and the rational roads the culture said they should go. I say this is perhaps Freud's greatest contribution, that he discovered the deceit in this willpower and substituted the unconscious wish. In this area of wish and drive lay Freud's profound power as a formulator of a new image of man that shook to the very foundations our emotional, moral, and intellectual self-image in Western history. It was in uncovering wish and drive that Freud discovered the unconscious and formulated it. He pointed out that the vast areas of behavior and motives were determined not by willpower, but by unconscious urges, anxiety, fears, and the endless host of bodily drives and instinctual forces. Under his penetrating analysis, Victorian willpower did indeed turn out to be a web of rationalization and self-deceit. Freud was entirely accurate, I believe, in his diagnosis of this morbid side of Victorian willpower. But this immediately leads us to our main problem. Along with this emphasis, there went an unavoidable undermining of the functions of will and decision themselves. There was an unavoidable emphasis upon man as driven, determined, lived by the unconscious, as Freud put it. This reflected, rationalized, and played into the hands of modern man's pervasive tendency, which has become almost a disease in the middle of the 20th century, to see himself as passive, as the willy-nilly product of psychological forces he could not control because they were unconscious, and also as the willy-nilly victim of the powerful juggernaut of economic forces, as Karl Marx demonstrated on the socio-economic level with an analysis parallel to Freud's. Of late years, this tendency has spread to include our conviction that we are the helpless victims of scientific forces in the atom bomb, about which man generally feels powerless to do anything. Indeed, I believe a central core of modern man's neurosis is the undermining of his experience of himself as responsible and the sapping of his willing and decision. This lack of will is more than an ethical problem, for the modern individual so often has a conviction that even if he did exert his will, his efforts would not make any difference anyway. Now it was precisely against these trends that the psychologist philosophers we call the existentialists, such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, took their strongest and most vehement stand. It is in the light of modern man's broken will that you can understand the contemporary existential movement. In the light of this broken will, you can understand the existential emphasis of Schopenhauer with his world as will and idea, of Bergson with his elan vital, of William James with his will to believe. The protest of the existentialists was violent and at times desperate, as in the case of Nietzsche. At other times, it was noble and courageous, as in the resistance movement of Camus and Sartre, even if it seemed to most observers that the efforts of these existentialists would be ineffectual against the moving lava of conformism, collectivism, and the coming robot man. The existentialists were undaunted, however, for their central proclamation was this: no matter how great are the forces victimizing the human being, man has the capacity to know that he is being victimized, and thus to influence in some way how he will relate to his fate. There is never lost that kernel of power to take some stand, to make some decision, no matter how minute. This is why the existentialists hold that man's existence consists, in the last analysis, of his freedom. Paul Tillich has phrased this point beautifully when he says, "Man becomes truly human only at the moment of decision." The implications for psychology of this problem of the undermining of man's sense of himself as responsible are, of course, profound. In general, in our academic psychological tradition, we have tended to accept the position, no matter what individual psychologists themselves believed about their own actions, that as psychologists we were concerned only with what is determined and can be understood in a deterministic framework. This limited our perception, of course, intended inevitably to make the man we studied over into the image of what we let ourselves see. In psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, where we dealt with suffering people, the problem of the undermining of will and decision became especially critical for the theory and process of psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis inevitably played into the passive tendencies of the patient. The psychologists Otto Rank and Wilhelm Reich back in the IgG0s began to point out that there were built-in tendencies in psychoanalysis itself, which sapped its vitality and tended to emasculate not only the reality with which psychoanalysis deals, but also the power and the inclination of the patient to change. In the early days of psychoanalysis, when revelations of the unconscious had an obvious shock value, this problem did not come so much out into the open. And in any case, with hysterical patients, who formed the bulk of those Freud dealt with in his early formative years, there does exist a special dynamic in what Freud could call repressed libido, which was pushing for expression. But these days, most of our patients are compulsives, or character disorders of one form or another. Everybody knows about the Oedipus complex, and it shocks nobody. Our patients talk about sex with an apparent freedom which would have shocked Freud's Victorian patients off the couch. Indeed, talking about sex is the easiest way of avoiding really making any deductions about love or sexual relatedness. And so the problem of the undermining of will and decision can no longer be avoided. Other forms of psychotherapy, not only the Freudian, also fall into the dilemma that we have been describing. The process of psychotherapy itself has built-in tendencies to invite the patient to relinquish his position as the deciding agent. The very name patient proposes it. Not only do the automatic supportive elements in therapy have this tendency, but so does the tendency to search for everything else to be responsible for one's problems rather than oneself. To be sure, the psychotherapists of all stripes and schools realize that sooner or later the patient must make some decisions and learn to take some responsibility for himself. But the theory and the technique of most psychotherapy tends to be built on exactly the opposite premise. Let us look for a moment at the dilemma the orthodox Freudians found themselves in. They tended to go along with Freud's theory of strict determinism of mental life, holding that the subjective experience of choice and responsibility are illusions. But as therapists, dealing with people in conflict, the analysts could not help recognizing that the patient's act of choosing was of central importance. Freud, as a psychotherapist, took a radically different view from his own theory. To quote from his book The Ego and the ID, analysis does not set out to abolish the possibility of morbid reactions, but to give the patient's ego freedom to choose one way or the other. The psychoanalysts thus found themselves in the curious contradictory position of believing that the patient must have an illusion of freedom in order to change, and they therefore must cultivate, or at least do obeisance to, this illusion. One of the contemporary psychoanalysts, Dr. Alan Wheelis, is particularly perceptive of this problem. I will read a quotation from his paper on will. Among the sophisticated, he writes, the use of the term willpower has become perhaps the most unambiguous badge of naivete. It has become unfashionable to try, by one's unaided efforts, to force one's way out of a condition of neurotic misery, for the stronger the will, the more likely it is to be labeled a counterphobic maneuver. The unconscious is heir to the prestige of will. As one's fate formerly was determined by will, now it is determined by the repressed mental life. Knowledgeable moderns put their backs to the couch, and in so doing may fail occasionally to put their shoulders to the wheel. As will has been devalued, so has courage, for courage can exist only in the service of will, and can hardly be valued higher than that which it serves. In our understanding of human nature, we have gained determinism, lost determination. Now Wheelis clearly sees that will is basically important in psychotherapy. The crucial importance of will, he writes, lies in the fact that it may nevertheless be the decisive factor in translating equilibrium into a process of change. Now I believe, as all the existentialists have believed, that we cannot rest in this contradiction in psychology and psychotherapy. Nor can we leave will and decision to chance. We cannot work on the assumption that ultimately the patient somehow happens to make a decision or slides into a decision by ennui, default, or mutual fatigue with the therapist, or acts from sensing that the therapist, now the benevolent parent, will approve of him if he does such and such. I believe we have to put decision and will back into the center of the picture. The very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. Not in the sense of denying what Freud describes as unconscious experience, for these deterministic, unconscious influences certainly operate in. Everyone who does therapy knows this, but rather by rediscovering will and decision on a new level that will make man's will soundly strong again. I propose first that in the revealing and exploring of the deterministic forces in his life, the patient is already orienting himself in some particular way to the data and thus is engaged in some choice, no matter how seemingly insignificant. He is experiencing some freedom in simply looking at his problems, no matter how subtle this freedom may be. This does not at all mean that we push the patient into decisions. Indeed, I am convinced that it is only by clarification of the patient's own powers that govern decision that the therapist can avoid inadvertently and subtly pushing the patient in one direction or another. My point is this, that self-consciousness itself, the person's potential awareness that the vast, complex, protean flow of experience is his experience, brings in inseparably the element of decision at every moment. I am, of course, using the terms will and decision in a way that does not at all refer exclusively to the great life-shaping decisions. The words have infinitely more extensive and subtle meaning. Even perception, when you stop to think about it, always involves a willing, e.g., in choosing what you are going to attend to. Decision always brings in some element that is not only not determined by the outside situation, but is not even given in the external situation. It involves some element of leap, some taking of a chance, some movement of oneself in a direction, the ultimate outcome of which you never can fully predict before the leap. This leap is obviously involved in the big decisions of life, but my point here is that qualitatively it is present in some degree or other in experiences as simple and non-world shaking as any new idea I find myself entertaining or any new memory that pops up in a seemingly random chain of free association. This is the reason that anxiety often arises in free associations, or that one gets frightened when some new idea is born. He then is in a new place. He sees himself and his life in a slightly different way, and he must reorient himself accordingly. The mature human being, i.e., the one who is not rigidly constricted and determined by neurotic compulsive patterns, generally can take this anxiety in stride and is then ready to make the new orientation, the new decision, in the place in which he now finds himself. But now as we turn to the endeavor to understand will and decision, we find that our task is not at all easy. Our problem hinges upon the terms will and wish and the interrelation between the two. The word will has been generally associated with willpower, and, as I have said, that makes it dubious to say the least. Perhaps it is not any longer helpful or even available, but the reality it has historically described must be retained. Willpower expressed the arrogant efforts of Victorian man to manipulate nature, to rule nature within. Iron hand as he did in industrialism and capitalism, he tried then to manipulate himself in the same way, to rule his own life as he ruled his coal cars, as an object shown particularly in Protestantism, but found in other modern ethical and religious systems as well. Thus, will was set over against wish and used as a faculty by which wish could be denied. I believe willpower is a dubious concept because it was used as a way of avoiding the awareness of bodily and sexual urges or hostile impulses. It was used as a way of avoiding everything that did not fit this calculated manipulation of society and oneself or the picture of the controlled, well-managed self. It is no solution to block off these levels of one's experience. We know clinically that the individuals from the Victorian age and after who did block off their wishes and bodily urges developed resentment, inhibition, hostility, inability to love, and other clinical symptoms, which was the reason for the necessity of psychotherapy. The process of using willpower to deny wish results in a greater and greater loss of emotion and leads to a progressive emptying of inner contents. Ultimately, this must impoverish our intellectual experience as well. I now propose to you that we find a new content for the meaning of will, and that we bring will together with Freud's emphasis on wish. In general, today we take wish to mean a concession to our immaturity, as though only children had wishes. Let me hasten to say that the term wish is to be seen in processes much more extensive than this. Its correlates can be found in all phenomena of nature down to the most minute pattern of atomic reaction, for example, in the negative and positive movements in microscopic and atomic nature. The leaves of the trees turn toward the light, as you know, and this tropism is, in one sense, the innate tendency in biological organisms to turn towards something, which is an analogy to human wish. Our problem then becomes the interrelation of wish and will. Wish and will can be seen as operating in polarity. Will requires self-consciousness. Wish does not. Will implies some possibility of freedom of choice. Wish does not. Wish gives the warmth, the content, the child's play, the freshness, and the richness to will. Will gives the self-direction, the freedom, and the maturity to wish. If you have only will and no wish, you have the dried up, Victorian, post-Puritan man. If you have only wish and no will, you have the driven, unfree, infantile human being who, as an adult, may become the robot man. Now I suggest the term decision to stand for the human act which brings both will and wish together. Decision in this sense does not deny or exclude wish, but incorporates it and transcends it. Decision in an individual takes into the picture the experiencing of all wishes, but it forms these wishes into a way of acting which is consciously chosen. Let me now show more fully the meaning of our problem by describing the three dimensions of wish, will, and decision in our practice of psychotherapy. The first dimension, wish, occurs on the level of awareness, the dimension which the human organism shares with all nature. We help the patient to experience his infantile wishes, his bodily needs and desires, sexuality and hunger, and all the infinite and inexhaustible gamut of wishes which occur in every individual. This is a central part of practically all psychotherapy, from that of Carl Rogers on one extreme to the most classical Freudian on the other. Experiencing these wishes may involve dramatic and sometimes difficult anxiety and upheaval, as the neurotic trauma which led to the blocking off of the awareness in the first place is brought into the open. In handling this, various kinds of therapy differ, but I cannot conceive of any form of psychotherapy which does not accord the process of awareness of wishes a central place. The experiencing of these wishes may come out in the simplest forms of the desire to fondle or to be fondled, the wishes which originally were associated with nursing and closeness to mother and family members in early experience. Our wish is for the touch of the hand of a friend or a loved one in adult experience, or the simple pleasure of wind and water against one's skin. This kind of awareness goes on all the way up to the sophisticated experiences which may come, for example, in a dazzling instant when you are standing beneath a maple tree in autumn and you are struck by how brilliantly blue the sky looks when seen behind this sea of crimson and scarlet. This immediate awareness of the world continues through life, hopefully at an accelerating degree, and is infinitely more varied and rich than one would gather from most psychological discussion. My point is that our wishes are not only good, but we should have more wishes rather than less. A growing awareness of one's body, wishes, and desires, processes which are obviously related to the experiencing of identity, normally also bring about a heightened appreciation of oneself as a being and a heightened reverence for being itself. Here the Eastern philosophies, like Zen Buddhism, have much to teach us, but we cannot stop with wishes. The second level, in the relating of wish to will in therapy, is the transmuting of this awareness into self-consciousness. This level is correlated with the distinctive form of awareness in human beings which is not present in animals, namely, Consciousness. The term consciousness comes etymologically from the words con plus sire, and it means knowing with. This is the level on which the patient experiences I am the one who has these wishes. This is the level of accepting oneself as having a world. If I experience the fact that my wishes, then, are not simply blind pushes towards someone or something, that J am the one who stands in this world where touch, nourishment, sexual pleasure, and relatedness may be possible between me and other persons, I can begin to see how I may do something about these wishes. This gives me the possibility of insight, or inward sight, the possibility of seeing the world and other people in relation to myself. I see that I myself am involved in these relationships of pleasure, love, beauty, trust, and I hopefully then have the possibility of changing my own behavior to make these more possible. This is the level on which will enters the picture, not as a denial of wish, but as an incorporation of wish on a higher level of consciousness. To refer to our example above, the experiencing of the blue of the sky behind the crimson maple leaves, taken simply on the level of awareness and wish, may bring delight. The desire is simply to continue or to renew the experience. But when you realize that you are the person who lives in a world in which trees are so beautiful and the sky so brilliant, and that you can even increase your pleasure by sharing this experience with a friend, this has profound implications for your life, love, even death, and all the other ultimate problems of human existence. This is the point where human creativity enters the picture. This is the point where we write a poem to share with other people our experience of the beautiful, or we paint a picture. Now, the third level in the process of psychotherapy is that of decision and responsibility. I use these two terms together to indicate that decision is not simply synonymous with will. Responsibility involves being responsive, it means responding. As consciousness is the distinctively human form of awareness, so decision and responsibility are the distinctive forms of consciousness in the human being who is moving towards self-realization, maturity, and integration. Again, this dimension is achieved not by denying wishes or self-assertive will, but it incorporates and keeps present the previous two levels in a new dimension. Decision forms together the two previous levels into a pattern of acting and living which is empowered and enriched by wishes, asserted by will, and is responsive to and responsible for the significant other persons who are important to oneself in the realizing of long-term goals. This point is demonstrated by Harry Stack Sullivan's interpersonal theory of psychiatry and also by Buber's I-thou philosophy. Will, wish, and decision occur within a nexus of relationships upon which the individual himself depends not only for his own fulfillment, but for his very existence. Now, this may sound to you like an ethical statement, and it is in the sense that ethics begin with this capacity of the human being to transcend the self-oriented wish and desire and to live in the dimensions of past and future, to live in terms of the welfare of persons and groups upon which his own fulfillment intimately depends. And so we have found in our journey through wish and will to decision and responsibility that we have come to the psychological basis of ethics. This also is a point the existentialists are always emphasizing, namely, that psychology and ethics are inseparable, which is nowhere shown better than in the area of will and decision. Creativity and the unconscious VV. When we face the question of creativity and the unconscious in our day, we immediately find ourselves before a difficult problem, i.e., the relation of unconscious experience to machines and techniques. As you all know, we live in a world that has been mechanized to an amazingly high degree. Now, irrational and unconscious phenomena are always a threat to mechanization. A poet may be a delightful creature in the meadow or the garret, but he is a menace on the assembly line. Mechanization requires uniformity, predictability, orderliness, and the very fact that unconscious phenomena are original and irrational is an inevitable threat to the bourgeois order and uniformity. This is one reason that Western man has been afraid of unconscious and irrational experience. What he does then, in his fear, is to put tools and techniques between himself and the world of the unconscious. This protects him from being grasped, being threatened by the frightening dimensions of irrational experience. Our tools and techniques ought to be ways of extending man's consciousness, but they can just as easily be defense mechanisms. That is man's way of protecting himself from his consciousness, and particularly from his deeper and wider dimensions, which we call the unconscious. Western man, since the Renaissance, as everyone knows, has emphasized the creativity in the realms of techniques and mechanics. In this field, that is the application of science, we have succeeded tremendously, and this is entirely appropriate on one level. But the very success of our technological creativity is also a great danger and may threaten our very existence. For if we are not open to the unconscious, the irrational aspects of creativity, then our very science and technology can serve to block creativity of the spirit. By creativity of the spirit, I mean creativity that has nothing whatever to do with technical use. I mean creativity in art, poetry, and music, and in other works which we create for our own delight and for the deepening and enlarging of meaning in our lives rather than for making money or for utilizing for technological power. It is this creativity of the spirit that gives birth to the values that direct man's technical power. Now I want to propose that to the extent we lose this free, original creativity of the spirit as it is exemplified in poetry and music and art, we shall also lose our scientific creativity. The scientists themselves tell us, particularly the physicists, that the creativity of science is very much bound up with the capacity of the human being to create freely, to create in what I have called the realm of the spirit. For example, in modern physics, it is clear that the discoveries that later become utilized for technological gains are discovered generally in the first place because a physicist can let his imagination go and finds his new atomic theory by the impetus of the urge to discover and the joy of finding something new. But then, as in the case of the atom bomb, the new discovery becomes a source of tremendous technological power in our society, a power that breaks up nationalistic barriers between nations. This is an illustration of how free creativity always runs the risk of upsetting our nicely worked out theories and our nice bourgeois systems. My point, you see, is not simply the distinction between pure and applied science. I am saying that the creativity of the spirit does and must threaten the very structure and presupposition of our rational and orderly society. Unconscious, irrational urges are bound by their very nature to be a threat to our rational life, and thus the anxiety we experience in creativity is inescapable. But it is also this very creativity that will lead us to the deeper dimensions of consciousness that can produce the values and the meaning for which we can use our technological power. If we shrink from the anxiety of free creativity, the creativity of the unconscious, and we block off the threatening new insights, then we will render our society progressively more empty and banal, and we will also cut off the headwaters of the river of creativity for science also. How does creativity from unconscious levels work? I wish now to begin our practical analysis of this question with an incident from my own experience. When I was doing my PhD research, which later was published as my book, The Meaning of Anxiety, I set out to study anxiety in a group of unmarried mothers, pregnant girls in their late teens and early 20s, in a shelter home in New York City. I had a good sound hypothesis on anxiety, approved by my professors and approved by me at the same time, namely, that the predisposition toward anxiety in individuals would be proportionate to how much they had been rejected by their mothers. In psychology, this is a generally accepted hypothesis. I assumed that these pregnant girls would be in an anxiety-creating situation by their being pregnant and unwed, and that I would then be able to study the source of their general anxiety, namely, maternal rejection, in a clearer way. Now I discovered that half of these girls fitted my hypothesis beautifully, but the other half did not fit at all, particularly the girls from Harlem and the Lower East Side, who had grown up in poverty-stricken homes. These children who had been radically rejected by their mothers did not fit. They would say to me, "We have troubles, but we don't worry." This was a very curious thing, and I had a hard time believing the data, yet my data seemed very clear. So far as I could tell by the Rorschach and all the other tests of the unconscious levels that I gave in these studies of these girls, the girls did not have any unusual degree of anxiety. They had been rejected severely by their mothers, but it did not make them anxious. How could this be? Had these girls become hardened, apathetic, so that they did not feel their rejection? The answer to that seemed clearly no. Were they psychopathic or sociopathic types which also do not experience anxiety? Again, no. I could not figure it out. I remember late one day, I put aside my books and papers in the little office I used in that shelter home, and I walked down toward the subway. About 50 feet this side of the entrance to the 8th Street station, it suddenly struck me out of the blue, which incidentally is a very fitting expression for this kind of insight, that the girls who didn't fit my hypothesis were all proletarian girls. And as quickly as that idea struck me, the other ideas poured into my mind. I think I had not taken another step on the sidewalk when a whole new form and a whole new hypothesis broke loose in my mind. I realized my whole hypothesis would have to be changed. I saw at that moment that it is not rejection by the mother that is the original trauma which is the source of anxiety. It is, rather, rejection that is lied about. The proletarian mothers rejected their children, but they never made any bones about it. The children knew they were rejected and they went out on the streets and found other companions. They knew their world. There was no subterfuge about their situation, and therefore they could orient themselves. The middle-class girls, on the other hand, were always lied to by their mothers. The middle-class girls were rejected by their mothers, but the mothers pretended they loved them, and this was really their source of anxiety, not the sheer rejection. I saw in that instantaneous kind of way that characterizes insights from the deeper levels in our consciousness that my hypothesis would have to be changed, that the anxiety comes from something different than sheer rejection. It comes from not being able to know the world you are in, not being able to orient yourself in your own existence. I was convinced in that instant on the street, and later thought and experience convinced me the more, that this is a much better theory, much more accurate and more elegant than my first hypothesis. This kind of sudden creative breakthrough occurs to scientists, to artists, to religious people, and probably to every one of us if we can but recognize it. Now let us ask what is going on at the time this breakthrough occurs. If we take this experience of mine to start with, we notice one thing first of all, that the insight broke into my conscious mind against what I was trying to think rationally. I had had a good sound hypothesis and I had been working very hard to prove it, but the unconscious, so to speak, broke through against the conscious belief to which I was clinging. The psychologist C.G. Jung has often made the point that there is a polarity, a kind of opposition, between unconscious experience and consciousness. He believed the relationship is compensatory. Consciousness controls the wild, illogical vagaries of the unconscious, while the unconscious keeps consciousness from drying up, from becoming banal, empty, and arid rationality. The compensation also works on specific problems. If I bend too far one way on some issue consciously, my unconscious, so to speak, will lean over the other way. This is why the more we are smitten with doubts about an idea unconsciously, the more dogmatically we fight for it in our conscious arguments. From the case of the conversion of St. Paul down to my incident concerning my anxiety hypothesis, the unconscious is apt to break through and to break up, exactly what we cling to most rigidly in our conscious thinking. What is going on, then, is not simple growth, but something much more dynamic. It is a kind of battle in the mind. A dynamic struggle is going on within the person represented on one side by what he thinks consciously and on the other side by some insight, some new perspective that is struggling to be born. The insight is then born with anxiety, but also with the joy and the gratification that come in the experiencing of a new aspect of the world. A second thing also occurred in the breakthrough of this insight, namely, everything around me became suddenly vivid. I can remember the greenhouses that were on that particular street, an ugly green that I preferred to try to forget immediately. But this experience was so vivid that the colors all around were sharpened and are embedded forever in my memory. The moment the insight breaks through, and this is generally instantaneously, there is a special translucence which envelopes the world, and our vision is given a special clarity. I am convinced that this is the usual accompaniment of the breakthrough of unconscious experience into consciousness, and this also is a reason why the experience scares us so much. Both the inner world and the outer world take on an intensity that may be momentarily overwhelming. This is one aspect of what is historically called the state of ecstasy, the uniting of unconscious experience with consciousness, a union that is not a mere abstraction, but a dynamic change of our minds, a dynamic immediate fusion of experience within us. It is important to emphasize that you do not get insights as though you were in a dream, with the world and yourself opaque, vague, and cloudy. It is a popular misconception that when we are getting an inner insight, our external perception is dull. I believe perception is actually sharper. One aspect of this insight is like a dream in that the self and the world become kaleidoscopic, but the other pole of the experience is that perceptions are sharpened. There is a vividness, a translucence of relationship to the world around us. The colors around me on 8th Street when I got this insight were completely irrelevant to the insight itself. It seems to me, however, that the intensity of vision, in which I could remember almost every crack on that pavement, characterizes the total world that surrounds one at the particular instant, a world that becomes vivid and unforgettable. Indeed, I would define the whole experience we are talking about as a state of heightened consciousness. Unconsciousness I define as the potentialities for awareness, knowing, and feeling which we cannot yet actualize. The breaking through from the unconscious brings an added intensity to our whole state of consciousness. The result is not only a heightened capacity to think, but also a heightened sensory process, a heightened capacity to feel, and intensified memory. In the third place, we observe when these insights occur that the breakthrough never comes hit and miss, but in accordance with a pattern, one essential element of which is our own commitment. The breakthrough does not come just by taking it easy, or by letting one's unconscious do it. The insight, rather, is born from unconscious levels in oneself, exactly in the areas to which we are most committed consciously. The insight came to me not on any old problem, but on the problem on which, up to 5 minutes before, when I had put my papers and books away in the little office, I had been working very intensively. Indeed, for several months I had devoted my best and most energetic conscious thoughts to this subject. The idea, the new form, which suddenly becomes present, comes in order to complete an incomplete form with which we are struggling in conscious awareness. Therefore, we can quite accurately speak of this unfinished pattern, this unformed call, as constituting the conscious call to which my unconscious gives the answer. The fourth characteristic of this kind of experience is that the insight comes at the moment of transition between work and relaxation. It comes, often, at the break in periods of voluntary effort. It is as though my intense application to the problem, my struggling with it and thinking about it, is my conscious endeavor, but some part of the pattern, the gestalt, that is different from what I am trying to think consciously at present, is struggling to be born. Out of this comes the tension involved in creative activity. If a person is too rigid, too dogmatic, and bound to previous conclusions, he will of course never let this new element into his consciousness. But the insight often cannot be born until the conscious tension, the conscious application, is relaxed. Einstein used to say he was always surprised by the fact that his best ideas came to him while he was shaving. This is a well-known phenomenon with all of us, that the unconscious breakthrough requires the alternation of intensely conscious work with relaxation, but it comes, as I must emphasize, only in the areas to which we are devotedly committed in our conscious thinking. Let us now call into our analysis the experience of one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, the French scientist Poincaré. Poincaré tells us with admirable clarity how his new insights and his new theories came to him, and he describes specifically the characteristics surrounding the occurrence of the type of breakthrough I have been cribbing in my own experience. I quote now from Poincaré's autobiography. For 15 days, he writes, I strove to prove that there could not be any functions like those I have since called Fuchsian functions. I was then very ignorant. Every day I seated myself at my work table, stayed an hour or two, tried a great number of combinations and reached no results. One evening, contrary to my custom, I drank black coffee and could not sleep. Ideas rose in crowds. I felt them collide until pairs interlocked, so to speak, making a stable combination. By the next morning, I had established the existence of a class of Fuchsian functions, those which come from the hypergeometric series. I had only to write out the results, which took but a few hours. Poincaré was then still a young man. He was called into the military service in France, and for some months, he tells us, nothing happened in his thinking. But one day in a town in southern France, he was getting on a bus and talking with another soldier. As he was about to put his foot on the step, he pinpoints the moment that exactly there broke into his mind the answer to how these new mathematical functions that he discovered related to the mathematics he had been working on before. He continued his step, got on the bus, and went on without a pause in the conversation he was engaged in with his friend. He was completely convinced, in this instantaneous way, of the accuracy of his new theory. When I read Poincaré's experience after the incident in my own life which I have related, I was struck by how similar it was to mine in this special precision and vividness. Now, Poincaré in his autobiography turned psychologist for a moment, and he asks the same question which I posed above. What is going on in one's mind at the moment when these ideas break through? This is the answer he gives. Most striking at first is this appearance of sudden illumination, a manifest sign of long unconscious prior work. The role of this unconscious work in mathematical invention appears to me incontestable, and traces of it would be found in other cases where it is less evident. Often when one works at a hard question, nothing good is accomplished at the first attack. Then one takes a rest, longer or shorter, and sits down anew to the work. During the first half hour, as before, nothing is found, and then all of a sudden the decisive idea presents itself to the mind. It might be said that the conscious work has been more fruitful because it has been interrupted and the rest has given back to the mind its force and freshness. But Poincaré says that it is not true in his judgment that the illumination comes simply because we have relieved fatigue or taken a rest. He says, it is more probable that this rest has been filled out with unconscious work and that the result of this work has afterwards revealed itself to the mathematician just as in the cases I have cited. Only the revelation, instead of coming during a walk or a journey, has happened during a period of conscious work. But independently of this work which plays at most a role of excitant, as if it were the goad stimulating the results already reached during rest, but remaining unconscious, to assume the conscious form. Poincaré then continues with a penetrating comment on the practical aspects of this breakthrough. There is another remark, he writes, to be made about the conditions of this unconscious work. It is possible, and of a certainty it is only fruitful if it is on the one hand preceded and on the other hand followed by a period of conscious work. These sudden inspirations, and the examples already cited sufficiently prove this, never happen except after some days of voluntary effort which has appeared obsoletely fruitless and whence nothing good seems to have come, where the way taken seems totally astray. These efforts then have not been as sterile as one thinks. They have set a-going the unconscious machine, and without them it would not have moved and would have produced nothing. Finally, with the help of Poincaré, let us ask what determines why a given idea, this particular idea, comes through from unconscious dimensions. Why not a dozen other ideas instead? Is it because a particular insight empirically best fits my hypothesis or best fits Poincaré's mathematical question? No, he answers, and I also would answer, no. Is it because the insight will work best pragmatically? Again, he answers, no. What he proposes, and I can best use his language because he speaks as one of the great scientists of our day, is that the given insight is selected not because it is useful or because it fits the scientific hypothesis, but rather because it has an elegance. It has what I would call a beauty. The useful combinations, writes Poincaré, are precisely the most beautiful. I mean those best able to charm this special sensibility which all mathematicians know, but of which the profane are so ignorant is often to be tempted to smile at it. What happens then? Among the great numbers of combinations blindly formed by the subliminal self, almost all are without interest and without utility, but just for that reason they are also without effect upon the aesthetic sensibility. Consciousness therefore will never know them. Only certain ones are harmonious, and, consequently, at once useful and beautiful. They will be capable of touching this special sensibility of the geometer of which I have just spoken, and which, once aroused, will call our attention to them, and thus give them occasion to become conscious. This is why the mathematicians and the physicists talk about the elegance of a theory. I want, therefore, to end this discussion with the point that the utility, the practical value of the theory, is subsumed as part of the character of being beautiful. That is, it has the character of harmony with the total world, the mental world within and the external world without. The harmony of an internal form, the inner consistency of a theory, the character of beauty that touches your sensibilities. These are significant factors determining why a given insight which comes would seem to be part of this harmony of the universe which comes to us as beauty. As a psychotherapist who works with people every day in conflict, anxiety, and trouble, I can only add that in my experience helping people achieve inner consciousness, unconscious dimensions of their experience to help them get insights, reveals the same phenomenon. The insights emerge not chiefly because they are rationally true, or even because they are helpful, but because they have a form that completes an incomplete gestalt, this person's life, a form that changes the meaninglessness of his existence to a life of meaning. Existential psychology and the sixth problem of death. Death has been one of the taboo subjects in psychology, along with extrasensory perception, homosexuality, until recently, and even existentialism itself in some quarters. These taboo subjects have one thing in common. If you take them seriously, you threaten deeply entrenched biases in our cultural beliefs. But the existential approach has always been a gadfly to the entrenched biases of our society, and it opens up significant new areas for inquiry, particularly into the problem of death. Heidegger, one of the leading existentialists, points out that death is the one absolute fact about life. The only thing I can know for sure, for example, is the fact that someday I shall die. Therefore, said Heidegger, death individualizes man. I do not think Heidegger had ever read the psychologist Otto Rank, but Rank also expressed the fact that it is death that individualizes man. My death means something qualitatively different to me from what it can to you, and vice versa. No one can die for me. It is the one thing that I have to do for myself. Therefore, even to know that I will die makes me experience myself as an individual, makes me stand alone. As Heidegger writes in his somewhat philosophical language, death is an irrelative potentiality which singles man out and individualizes him to make him understand the potentiality of being in others as well as himself, when he realizes the inescapable nature of his own death. As soon as we look at the question of death, we are struck immediately by one thing, and that is that modern Western civilization, particularly in America, has made a fetish of the repression of death. As in Victorian times sex was repressed, so now death and its symbolism are repressed. Death is thought of as obscene, unmentionable, pornographic, not to be looked at if one can help it, and certainly not to be talked about in polite company. We have big funeral services which seem purposed to demonstrate that, after all, the person did not die. We buy life insurance, which, despite its euphemistic name, does not insure life at all, but simply enables our heirs to be less economically burdened by our deaths. Their life can go on, ironically through our life insurance, as though we hadn't died. Death is viewed, also, as sex was viewed by nice Victorian women, as a dirty mistake, an unfortunate plague on our universe, perhaps necessary as nature's way of getting rid of the population which our sexuality spawns, but to be ignored as much as possible. Now I think this is a very unhealthy attitude toward death, and one of the results of this evasive approach has been that we look upon grief and mourning as sick. The implication is that when somebody dies, it is better if you don't feel grief, or at least the less grief the better, which means in a strange kind of logic that the more you deny the fact of death, the healthier you are. I think that one of the important assertions of modern psychotherapy, particularly the existential approach, is that when one has lost something genuine, whether it be a friend, a loved one, or a project that one was devoted to, mourning and grief are healthy emotions. Freud demonstrated with respect to sexuality that when individuals and social groups consistently repress and deny an experience which is both powerful and real, some symptoms are bound to appear. I think that the denial of death produces symptoms of lack of zest, the feeling that life is banal, empty, and vapid. Entwined in this denial of death is the romantic conviction that somehow life goes on and on and on, which we call our automatic progress. Our culture runs away from death by making a cult of progress. Utopianism in our day seems to me to be a reaction by which we can keep this denial of death going. All of this assumes that the meaning of life is simply how long you live. If you can keep living more and more and more, then you can slide into the illusion that death is outwitted. But the irony of it is that the very prolonging of death a few more years often leads to a lingering old age or invalidism, debility, senility, and loneliness. The ironic fact that comes out of this denial is that the denial of death is also the loss of life. It denies the reality of human existence and is a source of a great deal of the apathy that so many people in our modern Western world feel. The denial of death is also a source of some of the curious perversions that appear in odd ways in modern civilization. One of the astute commentators on our American civilization, Jeffrey Gorer, thinks that it is this denial of death that gives rise to the violence and the sadism that come out in our comics and our TV programs. Noting the denial of the topic of death as though death were pornographic, Gorer writes, "Nevertheless, people have to come to terms with the basic facts of birth, of copulation, and of death, and somehow accept their implications. If social prudery prevents this being done in an open and dignified fashion, then it will be done surreptitiously. If we dislike the modern pornography of death, then we must give back to death, natural death, its parade and publicity, readmit grief and mourning. If we make death unmentionable in polite society, not in front of the children, we almost ensure the continuation of the horror comic. No censorship has ever been really effective. The repression of death and the symbols of death is unfortunately not absent among psychologists. Erich Fromm's later work is an example of this. Fromm separates people into two categories: those who love life, which he calls the biophilists, and those who love death, the necrophilists. Plus this latter, of which Hitler is a pure example, is characterized by their preoccupation with feces, decay, and death. Man's aim in life, Fromm states, is to be attracted by all that is alive and separate himself from all that is dead. The trouble is that Fromm then forms a system which makes death itself the evil to be avoided. And, since in reality no one Erich Fromm, The Heart of Man, New York, Harper and Row, 1964. Page 48. 2 Ibid, page 48. Man can avoid the fact that he shall die. The implication is that we should not look at it, and in effect evade a large segment of the reality of human experience. Sadness is sinful, writes Fromm at one point. And again, sadness is sin. But sadness is surely healthy and necessary emotion when someone or something we love dies, or when there is a tragic conflict. Many of us are profoundly sad about what is going on in Vietnam, and this sadness is and should be a motivation for positive action against the evils in the situation. Fromm's strictures against sadness come close to supporting exactly Huxley's Brave New World, which Fromm used so eloquently to attack. Another strange result of Fromm's dichotomy is seen when he names Carl Jung as an outstanding example of the necrophilous character, citing Jung's interest in the corpse of a French soldier of a century and a half earlier, which was unearthed during the excavation of his house, and Jung's general interest in death as shown in his dreams and writing. But Fromm adds that Jung was an unusually creative person, and creation is the opposite to necrophilia. The explanation is that Jung solved his conflict, Fromm says, by balancing his destructive forces against his constructive ones. But far from this being the incidental point Fromm makes it, this is the basic point all along, that creativity and other positive goals of life come not out of biophilia as opposed to necrophilia, but come out of the dialectic relation between the two. Creativity is born in the courageous confronting of death, not the denying of it. As an ancient Chinese poet put it, We poets struggle with non-being to force it to yield being. 5. The chief problem is that such a dichotomy inescapably leads, quite apart from any intention of the authors, to a playing ostrich with evil and tragedy. At one point from speaks of the valley of the shadow of death as something to be avoided like the plague. The psalmist, however, took a 3 ibid, page 47. For ibid, page 48. 5 quoted by Archibald MacLeish, Poetry and Experience, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1961. 6 ibid, pages 48, 59. Different view. He faced it directly, as part of the human situation. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. From asks why people accept the vast preparations for nuclear war so docilely and with so little protest, and gives the answer. Because they love death. I propose the exact opposite, namely, that their apathy is related to the repression of the reality of death. We don't look at death. We believe somehow a Holocaust can't happen here. And so go on trusting that since civilization survived gunpowder and the bow and arrow, it will survive the nuclear bomb. What is omitted from is the fact that those who truly are devoted to life are able to be so by virtue of confronting death. The loving of life for its own sake is a dehumanization of the human being. From notes with commendation that man will do almost anything to preserve his life. This is man at his most craven. The human being is distinguished in the evolutionary line by virtue of the fact that he can make some values more important to him than life itself. Now believing, as I do, that Gorer is correct, that the denial of death leads to perverted forms of sadism and violence, and, as I have added, breeds apathy and even lack of zest in what life we do have. Then let us look toward the ways in which we may confront death constructively. When we do face the fact that we shall sometime die, we realize that mere biological survival, mere longevity of existence, is not enough. We must have values that are greater than mere biological life, otherwise our lives will be empty, no matter when we die. The ancient Greeks have much to teach us in this connection. They said in 100 different ways that unless one has the courage to give up one's life for some value, life itself will have no meaning. Not life, said Aristotle, but the good life is to be valued. When the biological life itself is the ultimate value, which I believe is a deterioration of the American dream, one feels he must hang on at all costs, and what he then settles for is a kind of death in life, that is to say, conformism. Conformism is the tendency of the individual to let himself be swallowed. Ibid. Page 45. Up in a sea of collective responses and attitudes. As I see it, conformism is an actual partial death even though one's body keeps on living. It is a loss of one's awareness, the loss of your potentialities and sensibilities, the loss of whatever characterizes you or me as a unique and original being. Now by this means we temporarily escape the anxiety of death, of not being, but it is at the price of forfeiting life. We forfeit our own possibilities, we give up our own sense of existence. As Paul Tillich has so well put it, the person gives up being because he is afraid of non-being. It is a surrendering of the meaning of life because we are afraid of death. We also note that confronting death is necessary for creativity. Indeed, artists have proclaimed to us all down through the ages that creativity and death are very closely related. A biological analogy is that the baby teeth must be pushed out to make room for the adult teeth. The psychological analogy is that the adolescent must fight free of his parents, that is, he must kill some relationship to his parents. Generally, he goes about this in an exaggerated way in order to be free, so that something new in himself may be born, and that there will be some possibility of finding a love partner of his own to depend upon outside his family. Every original thought requires that I let something in myself go. It is to some extent a death. I cannot have a new idea except that something in my old way of thinking dies which has been tied to my security. A dying is required to this old security if something new, which may hopefully be a more sound security, is to be born. This is why artists and poets are always telling us that the recognition of death is essential to the creative act and that the creative act itself, from human birth on, is the capacity to die in order that something new may be born. The anxiety that the creative person must face is this anxiety of temporary nothingness, like the artist Mondrian or Cezanne, They cut away the old forms of art, and then hopefully, if they are creative as these artists indeed were, something new is born. But it is born only if they can face the anxiety of this temporary abyss, only if they can face the process of the destruction of the old forms and old security. This is why the great artists Van Gogh, Michelangelo, and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard in the field of the art of ideas experience such a tremendous tension of consciousness. This tension of consciousness must be born as the stretching of the self between the process of the death of old forms to the birth of new ones, and sometimes it drives the artist to the brink of psychosis. Even in the sexual sphere, we find that sexual creativity, the procreating of new beings, and the creating of pleasure, joy, meaningful relationship, is symbolically related in all kinds of mythology to the act of death. It is necessary to be able to surrender, to give oneself up. This is shown biologically in the examples of the queen bee and the praying mantis. The act of copulation in all kinds of mythology is expressed in language that is synonymous with death. Fortunately for us human beings, literal death does not occur each time we make love, but something of that quality does occur. One cannot love unless he can let himself go, abandon himself, give himself, go through the abyss of the loss of a previous state of existence, with the hope and the expectation of new meaning in his human relationship. The confronting of death itself, the courageous awareness of the fact that I will die, is not only the first necessary step in constructively meeting this problem, but is in itself an ennobling act. Blaise Pascal, the French scientist and philosopher of several centuries ago, makes a very penetrating observation. Man is only a reed, wrote Pascal, the feeblest reed in nature, but he is a thinking reed. There is no need for the entire universe to arm itself in order to annihilate him. A vapor, a drop of water, suffices to kill him. But were the universe to crush him, man would yet be more noble than that which slays him, because man knows that he dies, and the advantage that the universe has over him, of this the universe knows nothing. Thus all our dignity lies in thought. Pascal meant by this word, thought, not intellectualization, or rationalization, or abstract concepts, but rather he meant consciousness. He meant the reasons of the heart, as well as the reasons of the mind. He says, thus all our dignity lies in consciousness, and goes on to say, by thought we raise ourselves, not by space and time, which we cannot fill. Let us strive then to think well. Therein lies the principle of morality. Pascal is saying here that the confronting of death actually increases the intensity of human consciousness. When I become aware that I am but a reed, that the universe can crush me and sometime will actually crush me in my actual death, then the significance, the preciousness, the individual meanings, as well as the universal meaning of my capacity for consciousness, become all the more significant to me. The awareness of death sharpens our sense of being. I know this sounds paradoxical, but I am not using the words loosely. The capacity to face death is the means by which we gain freedom. Man is the being who can know that at some future moment he will not be. He is always in a dialectical relationship with his own death. The failure to face this is what I have called conformity, giving up one's ideas to fit into the group, becoming the organization man, adjusting by surrendering one's consciousness. But Pascal has proposed to us that there is another alternative, namely, facing the fact that I may not exist and certainly at some point I will not exist, and grasping it in such a way that my experience of the moment is heightened. Then experience becomes something that is not simply automatic. It loses its vapidness and emptiness and becomes an experience of concrete self-awareness. Life takes on vitality and immediacy, and the individual can experience a heightened consciousness of himself and of the world around him. The awareness of death also has another value, and this is that it is the ultimate source of human humility. The fact that you and I at some time will die puts us, in the last analysis, in the same boat with every other man, free or enslaved, male or female, child or adult. The facing of death is the strongest motive, and indeed requirement, for learning to be fellow men. No matter how much you may dislike the Russians or the Chinese, the Arabs dislike the Jews, or the Jews the Arabs, each of us knows that someday they will die as we will die. Therefore, in the long run, we are all in the same boat. This is what Theseus meant in Sophocles' play Oedipus at Colonus when he said, I know that I am only a man, and I have no more to hope for in the end than you have. Death is this humanizing fact that we all, as men, must face. And it takes us all, whether black or white, red or brown, intelligent or stupid, beyond self-righteousness. It places us all in need of mercy and forgiveness by the others, and makes us all participate in the human drama in which no man can stand above. Another. I wish to give here an example from my own life. When I was writing my doctoral dissertation on anxiety, I fell sick with tuberculosis and spent 2 years in bed in Saranac. This was before the development of the drugs for the treatment of tuberculosis, and we patients were always on the abyss. That is, we never knew from the X-ray of 1 month to the next whether we would live or die. We had, as you can imagine, tremendous anxiety about death. In the course of those years, I read the 2 books on anxiety that had been written up to that time, Freud's The Problem of Anxiety and Kierkegaard's The Concept of Dread. Freud described anxiety as the return of the repressed libido, and anxiety as the ego's reaction to the threat of the loss of the loved object. Now I knew these were important points in psychological dynamics, and I greatly valued them. But the strange thing was they did not speak directly to my anxiety in that very anxious period. Then when I read Kierkegaard, I found him describing anxiety in terms of the struggle of a living person against non-being. He went on to point out that the terror in the experience of anxiety arises not from the threat of death as such, but from one's ambivalent conflict in relation to the threat, i.e., the fact that one is tempted to give in to the threat. I had the immediate experience that Kierkegaard was talking about exactly what I was undergoing, the struggle between the possibility of my living or dying, or the possibility of my living as a lifelong invalid. As Kierkegaard put it, it is not death as such that scares us, but the fact that each of us has within himself tendencies on both sides of the fight. Anxiety is a desire for what one dreads, he wrote. Thus, like an alien power, it lays hold of an individual, and yet one cannot tear oneself away. Now what was going on in me and the other patients in the tuberculosis sanatorium was a flirting with death. Often it occurred to me, maybe it is better to be a lifelong invalid. I am taken care of here. I can lie in bed and look at the mountains. One could make a life of this. And I saw many of the other patients not only flirting with the possibility of being lifelong invalids, but choosing the possibility. Or, when I was more scared, I caught myself asking silently, would it not be better to die than to lie here for another year, never knowing whether I live or die? The perpetual not knowing, perpetual time going on, with nothing ever certain, morning, noon, supper, and then night again with its dread. Sleeplessness. All this can seem a more painful burden than death itself. When many of us did learn to confront directly the problem of death as we lay with our tuberculosis, we discovered that we were enabled to overcome 2 of the false ways of dealing with death. One false way was the nonchalant attitude. Unable to confront the anxiety of death, patients around us, and ourselves often, would become excessively cheerful, happy-go-lucky, and frivolous. This was the symptom of the outright denial of the terror of death. Others became depressed, phlegmatic, and helpless, the false way of dealing with death by hopelessly giving up. They already succumbed to death before the body died. This uncertainty of lying forever with the unknown door at the end of the corridor labeled life or death, if it was not directly faced, meant in many cases that patients did not adequately follow the treatment and did actually die. The flirting with death consists of being partly on the side of death. The anxiety is the expression of a conflict that is not openly faced, a conflict that we are unable to bring into consciousness and take a stand on. Thus, the ultimate question about death was first of all, can one face it even in such difficult situations? Can one take a stand toward it? I believe that what we were facing in an ultimate form there in the tuberculosis sanatorium was the same thing, qualitatively, that people in our day face in the pressure to become organization men. They face the questions, shall I give in to partial death? Shall I conform? Shall I give up my originality? Shall I relinquish my consciousness and vitality? when on the other hand one does learn that he can confront death, and he had better do so, as Pascal and Kierkegaard and the existentialists adjured us. Then he notices, as I noticed with my tuberculosis, a strange gift that appears. When I could confront death, I discovered a radical change in my relation to time. Before that, time had been my taskmaster. Time had been a straitjacket. I must do this. I have to meet that deadline. I am required to meet this or that appointment. Normally, in our culture, we are all slaves to time. We live most of our lives with the clock and the calendar as our masters. This, I realized, was part of the reason that I had fallen ill with tuberculosis. I had used my body as a machine and sold it into slavery to time and external requirements. But the facing of the fact of death brought a new element into the picture, namely, that each day I was alive was a gift. The time itself became a gift to me. Often in the second half of their lives, whether they are healthy or sick, whatever may be going on, people experience this necessity to confront the fact that they will die in a score or more of years. And often in the confronting of this fact, they discover the same gift of time. There is some time left, we realize, and the choice then is open to a greater or lesser extent. What shall we do with the remaining time that we have? It may suddenly occur to me that each morning I get up provides me with 15 or 16 new hours, and that I can choose what attitude I shall take towards these hours. To be sure, I have my responsibilities as a psychotherapist. I must see my patients. I must teach my classes. But I can choose how I shall use these hours in fulfilling these tasks. Shall I do so as a robot slave? Or shall I use these hours as mine, filling them with my consciousness, choosing in my classes and in my work, with patience, that I shall be there as a man who has his own consciousness and wants to share it, who has chosen to be there, and therefore who uses and fills the time that he has. Something more is going on here than merely a shift of subjective attitude. What I am frankly saying is that there is also greater objective choice when we can make the inner subjective choice. The question no longer is simply, what do we have to do? It is, rather, what can we do? What do we wish to do? It does not change the fact that I live in a world with other people and have my responsibilities, and it certainly does not change the fact that someday I shall die. But it does change my attitude toward the hours that I have between now and the time of my death, and thereby changes to some extent my objective choices. The shift is possible because time is now a gift and not a slave driver. It is ours to use, rather than a straitjacket to confine us. This depends, I have tried to indicate, on an initial decision, an initial commitment, which in turn depends upon my making a stand against the temptation to deny death, to narcotize my sensitivity to death. I face the fact of death within my own consciousness, and J then can make my own choice about the time that is left to me. Henrik Ibsen's last play was called When We Dead Awaken. In it, the chief character is a very successful elderly sculptor who is now fed up and bored with life. He asks the woman who was once his model, who had loved him but whom he would not permit himself to love, the following question: when we dead awaken, what shall we find? She responds in the play, we shall find that we have never lived. This is one answer, and the one that haunts the days and nights of multitudes of people in our prosperous 20th century and generally leads them to deny even the question of death. But if the question is not denied but faced, we can arrive at other answers to Ibsen's question. Some of these answers can be, we can know that we have loved and that we have made friends who matter to us. We shall know that we have brought some beauty and some meaning into our lives. We shall know that we have sought not to betray our own consciousness, and when we have betrayed it, we have at least admitted this fact to ourselves. We shall know that we have tried to know our own potentialities honestly, and to some extent, at least, we have lived up to them. We have not turned a deaf ear to being, but we have listened to the call of being, and we have responded. When we dead awaken, then hopefully we shall know that we have lived and have lived with some significance. What more can be expected of any man? Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.